Really excited to catch up and talk through this awesome paper you recently published. Thanks for being willing to chat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Love talking about learning.
Well, awesome. I want to actually just start there with that term learning, or really just start with the title.
Mm,
The titles of your papers, it's like coding in the dark, the need for learning cultures within coding teams. And so as I read that initially, before I read the paper, I was wondering like what do you actually mean by learning? Like what is a learning culture
mm,
and what does learning mean within the context of your research? I'd love to get your
yeah,
perspectives on that.
absolutely. I think that it can be easy to hear the word learning and think that's a thing that we all did in school. You went to a classroom and there was a 9 to 3 or a 7 to 3 or whatever kids have to deal with now. And that's learning. And then you get into your adult life and it's over. You just know what you have to know. And your head was like a bucket that you just fill up with content, and that's it. Um, but that's not actually how we work as human beings. So, learning to me, and of course, I'm a learning scientist by training, so you can expect me to care a lot about this. But to me, learning is a core thing that we do in the world. It is a way that we operate. And so you can think of it almost like a practice. And I think within engineering teams, this becomes so clear because anyone who has written code realizes you have to go on this continuous learning journey throughout your life. So, learning can be a lot of things, it can happen in a lot of domains, but it is ultimately the process of updating your mental models, right? The process of taking in new information and then also changing your behavior in response to that information, right? And I think that there are a lot of really interesting things about how it works, and also stereotypes we hold about it. So that was all kind of in the background as I was working on this project.
Well, that's a lot to capture in one term, and you definitely updated my mental model for what learning culture means. So, what sparked, and you can kind of go into your background a little bit here, but like what
Mm,
sparked and inspired you to actually write this paper?
yeah. I start the paper. It was a bit of a challenge for me because when I wrote this, I tried to write it just so authentically, honestly, which was a delightful experience. You get trained as a researcher. So my background is I have a PhD in quantitative, empirical psychology, behavioral interventionism. I also was a postdoctoral fellow in a place called the Design Lab at UC San Diego, where I worked with HCI and engineering teams. So I've been involved in research for a long time. And the further I've gotten, the more I've wanted to tackle kind of almost like simpler and simpler ideas, ideas that we all experience and need to talk about. And that motivated me really from the beginning. Um, and moving into tech as a researcher, I've just found that that is where you can have huge impact because we need to tell stories that can travel, I think. And so, to get more specific about this paper, I think I have something in the beginning of it where I say, I was really curious about why is it that we know all of this stuff from learning science. There's all this work in classrooms. There's all this work with, really interesting things about how human beings problem solve. Why are we not asking what this looks like for developers? And I'm not saying there's not a ton of research about developers because, as you know, it's a wonderful field. But I had felt that there was a bridge wasn't being built, right? Between, looking at the dynamics on this team and then saying, where are there sort of fundamental, social science theories that can help us understand what I think are sometimes very paradoxical and challenging things. So questions like, we all want to say that we're a team that's like learning and growing and sharing. Why are we not doing that? Even though we're well intentioned, even though it's our goal, even though maybe it's on the poster of the wall. And there are very good and valid reasons that that doesn't happen for teams. I mean, good and valid in the sense of it's a strategy that makes sense. But knowing that strategy means we can change it. So that was kind of my vision for getting into this. And I started with a qualitative project because I felt like it really had to come in the words and the like lived experience and the working day-to-day experience of developers.
Well, I really love that, and I love the question you were sort of driving at, which you kind of mentioned was like this paradox of we all have this poster on our
Mm.
culture decks of our teams and companies that say we want to continuously learn and
Hmm.
improve. Yet, as I'm sure we'll find out soon, maybe that's not always the case. I'm curious, were there any other sort of concrete research questions in addition to that one that you were looking to explore?
Yeah, I was looking for a couple of different things, and you'll see this in the structure of the study if we go into it. I wanted to do, I wanted to talk about people ramping into a new code base because I felt that that was also an underexplored moment for developers. I had this hunch, and it's a educated hunch based on working with a lot of developer teams. I had this perception that there's the a moment when people often feel really lost, and it's kind of taken for granted that they're going to navigate into a new code base really well, and it is part of the skill set of engineers. But I would say maybe one of my core research questions, because when I looked at that moment I thought that's a really interesting moment of people problem solving. And something that I thought was very interesting about that moment is people are learning a lot of stuff, and it doesn't always look like they're doing very much, right? Because they're not necessarily writing code yet. They're actually doing a lot of research and problem solving and updating their mental models about the code. And I realized there was this huge gap because when I talked to engineers or I saw it on, surveys I'd done before, there was this feeling like I have to do this work. It's really, really key. And actually, I learn the most when I'm doing this work, but it feels like the people around me don't see it. So you asked about the title of the report, Coding in the Dark, is a quote from one of the participants about this moment. So I wanted to try to design a study where we could really talk about that moment of like pre-production of code and why is it so important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If, as you kind of described the kind of onboarding into a new code base journey, it made me definitely think of kind of how I picture that if I'm
Mm.
joining a new company. And it's definitely fraught with, oh boy, here we go. The documentation is going to be at best, broken.
We're going to act like it works, and I'm going to get
Exactly.
in there and I'm going to find out it's out of
Yeah.
date.
And
Yeah.
once we get past that, then there's the code, which I'm sure is just going to be, a bunch of, opinions of all the past people who've worked in the code with no kind of explanation for a new person to really understand. So I'm sure we'll dive more into that, but I love the vision for the research. I'm curious. Did you look at, was there any like prior research that you looked at, prior papers to kind of
Oh,
help
yeah.
spark these ideas or just guide the way in which you approach this?
Definitely. Something that I loved about working on this report actually was I got to almost became a little pantheon of people who've inspired me. So it's really um just to wear my heart on my sleeve about it. It was such a passion project for me, and it was so motivated by my desire to really cross disciplinary borders because I told you I was trained as a psychologist. I moved into tech. I've been an applied social scientist. I've been called a lot of different things. Um, and I just think that so many areas of research have so much to teach each other. And I've always thought that way. And so in this report, I pull from research from people like Andre Simpian, who does this amazing work about when we think about there are fields of work that consider brilliance something that people are born with. And that is kind of a core belief that can be really damaging, actually, and can perpetuate some of these bad dynamics. But that's all the way in the realm of like kind of foundational social science stuff. And then, this really pragmatic and tactical developer research, of course, like Nicole Forsgren's work and people like that, Peggy Story, who you know well. Um, those kinds of papers and also informed what I thought about and what I talked about. I'd say, there was a lot of really interesting work about code reviews, what makes code reviews work, a lot of really interesting stuff about the individual cognition of developers. What I didn't find so much, and this, I'm not a perfect summary of the whole field, but What I didn't find so much was discussion of how it all emerges for a team. And that's where I think I see the field needs to move towards caring about developer experience, right? As you know, as a big team effort. And so I tried to bring in some of the social science stuff about learning and feedback and what it means and where these cues come from and what would that look like for developers, and sort of bring my data to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, I love that. And I agree with this, that the bridge you're trying to build with kind of taking the research and moving more into the sort of here and now of how teams actually would apply these concepts and leverage them in their
Yeah.
day-to-day work.
And I
So
think there
oh,
was
go
some
ahead.
interesting gaps. Sorry, just sparked a thought. There were interesting gaps the other direction because I was thinking about how much learning scientists could learn from developer teams, and how, so much of what we have learned about how people problem solve is based on classrooms, based on kind of like short-term relationships. You can imagine like an engineering team that has years of relationships, years of working together, and that was something I thought was also like, wow, this is just barely scratching the surface of the insight that can come the other way, right? From investing and really, we have this amazing activity that's happening from developer teams, at scale. And um, some opportunity I see there is stuff, especially like collaborations between seniors and juniors, right? How do we all help each other learn more? That to me is something that is not always captured in the academic research, and we would really benefit from that.
That's a really interesting thought because I completely agree. Like I think before we started this conversation, we mentioned we're trying to help bring some of this research more into the hands of practitioners, and that was
Mm-hmm.
one of your goals with this research as well. But there's also like the opposite end, which is bringing the work of practitioners more into the lens of what research is focused on as well, is
Mm-hmm.
equally important. So that's a fun observation that you shared. I'd love to get into the sciencey stuff a little bit. So you had these questions, this vision for the research. What did you do to conduct this
Yeah.
study?
Yeah. So qualitative study, exploratory work. There's a lot of details in the report. So you can even see, I think, my guiding question script and things like that. So I tried to really be transparent about that. I went in from the very beginning. The consent and research ethics is really foundational for me. I try to operate with this model that I call co-design with participants, which you may have heard before. And it's a little bit of the idea that, hey, I have to build in a cycle, where the people who opt into my research are able to also inform the research, right? Like I have things I can draw on from this previous research about how we measure things, but ultimately, you're trying to dig into an area. And I think one of the goals of qualitative research is not to do highly generalizable, big scale quantitative stuff. I think it's much more about getting such a good, rich, multidimensional representation of what's happening that then you can build scalable work on top of. So, in order to do that, I thought, okay, I need to recruit kind of a diverse sample of people. So, that was a big goal of mine. And you'll see that there's a range of experiences. Some folks were um, very senior engineers, some folks were interns, right, at a large tech company, some folks there were a couple boot camp people, just a lot of different experiences there. And so I reached out to people and recruited them on my own, and but with that kind of very structured plan in place. And then what did we sit down and do? So I asked them to participate in a research session with me, and there were two components to it. There was sort of a reflective, like a traditional interview where you sit down and you go deep into. I had some prompting questions around, tell me about ramping into a new code base, and that was kind of a just an opening, entry point to talk about learning for them. But then I also really, really wanted us to sit down and have a qualitative session still, but something where they were actually problem solving in front of me. And so I did what we called a search observation. And I asked people to bring in something that they were really working on, right? Some actual piece of code. A lot of people brought in a bug related thing they were trying to write, something that felt like a discrete task they could kind of get something progress on. for about half an hour. They sat down with me, and we had to design this very carefully with them, right? Because we asked for permission, from their work, and we ended up, this is again part of the co-design. I ended up deciding I wasn't going to ever look at their screen, right? Because not going to look at their code. Um, for the confidentiality of it. But what I was going to do was sit next to them and just listen to them talk out loud about the decisions they were making. So that was such a cool part of this. And so we got these two kinds of, text and audio data from people, both them reflecting on their experience and then them actually solving it. And then I did thematic analysis, right? We boiled up a lot of themes, which I go pretty deep into in the paper.
Well, thanks for the explanation of the methodology. And we'll definitely get into some of the themes. But I'm curious, as you were doing these interviews one by one, like,
Mm.
do you recall anything that was extremely surprising or fascinating to you as you were like in it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what was I'm laughing a little bit because everything is fascinating to you when you're a researcher. It was a great study. I have to say it was one of those ones where every conversation had so many layers to it. And I think that was maybe a piece of it. Was sometimes you go in and you ask about stuff and it's really quite on the surface for people. They can diagnose things about their code review or things about, but this one, because I really wanted to get to this like over time experience of learning, we had to kind of, I had to ask people again and again. So one thing that I remember happening is that you would ask people, hey, um, does your team do documentation, or tell me about how your team leaves comments? And they would say, oh, yes, absolutely. Like, we do documentation, and here's the standard, and it goes like this. And then I had this follow up question I always asked, which was, that sounds great and thank you. And how much of the time do you think that works? And everybody said 10% of the time, 15% of the time. And so suddenly we were having this conversation about the poster on the wall, right? The things we say we're going to do and the things they're actually doing. And I love to try to move people into that conversation of, what are we really doing? And can we be really curious about why it's not happening? And this is a scary and a hard conversation for people to have, especially when you're talking about your own work, your own performance. So something else that, is really maybe a researcher, a wonky kind of point, but I felt that sitting next to people as they were trying to like solve a bug in front of me, that was a really, really cool part of this project, because they got to hear me not judge them, actually be very interested in what was happening. And I think that that mattered a lot to this whole topic.
Well, there's so much there, and you really left me with a cliffhanger on that piece about documentation, because documentation has been something I've been really interested in because it
Mm,
emerged in the research study we did on developer experience, and it's been emerging a lot with a lot of organizations we work with. So I definitely want to come back to that,
yeah.
but kind of moving a little more broadly speaking, in the paper, I know one of the findings or sort of points you make, you mentioned that code writers describe this pressure to perform coding output
Hmm.
that created an implicit discouragement of spending time on work that they knew would support future learning and future collaborators. So I'm sure documentation is one of the quote unquote like the work to support future learning and future collaborators. Is there other types of activities or work? Like, what other specific activities are you referring to?
Yeah. So by specific activities, you mean like what would be the sort of learning focused behaviors that start to get discouraged?
Exactly, and
Yeah,
it aside from creating documentation.
right. So I think it shows up all over the place. I think it shows up in code review. For instance, have you taken the time to go deep when you realize that somebody has really misperceived something, really doesn't share a mental model? When do you do that? Um, I have some recommendations about what people should do, and in those recommendations you can kind of see what are the signals of like a really authentic learning culture. And I think it includes things like, we have recognized as a team that we need to protect this kind of time. We can say we're going to have a retrospective process, But if every time we have a retro, it's just in order to punish people or to find something that went wrong, we're not really going to feel safe in that retro, right? So that's one kind of recommendation is, are there safe spaces that have been built to have this kind of conversation? And, I think that it shows up in whether, all kinds of practices we could go deeper in, whether you've thought about pair programming, mob programming. Yeah, I'll stop there, but you can tell me what's interesting to dive into.
Yeah, no, that's my mind kind of floated into what you were talking about, and like you mentioned, not only protect creating those safe spaces, but also you mentioned before that being protective of the time, right?
Hmm.
Like sort of having the time to be able to actually devote to doing these types of activities. So I'd love to actually go like one step back and
Mm.
talk about that documentation
Mm.
piece. So you mentioned that you would ask people, do you have a process? Like, how do you do documentation? They would say, yeah,
Hmm.
oh, yeah, 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 we do it. Here's how. And then you would
Hmm.
go one step deeper. And I guess so can you draw the line here? I assume you discovered that documentation wasn't maybe happening so successfully. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah. So let me maybe like a useful thing would be to say, I think there's this question of learning culture, and then we can contrast this with something else, which I would call performance culture. And it's a little bit of a good guy bad guy story, in my paper. But I like to say, we need elements, we need to perform sometimes, we need to make a trade-off decision and decide, look, I have to execute, I have to write this code, it has to get in front of somebody, my team needs it in order to do something. Leaders especially, right, are facing these kinds of choices. But the problem is, right, that your team can accrue this kind of debt, which I call learning debt in the paper, like as an analogy to tech debt. And I think that not investing in good documentation is one of those kinds of practices. So why do teams not do it? I think very rightfully they start to notice that even though they're told documentation matters, or they're told this is the practice, it doesn't actually matter as much as other things matter. And so, in moments of friction, like moments of tension, time pressure, they'll make a choice, and systematically, things like documentation will never be that choice, right? Can you see and hear me? Okay, I'm getting a little bit of
Yep.
visual.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can
great.
hear. Yeah, totally
Yeah.
coming in clear.
So, one of the big points I try to make in the paper is people, as learning creatures, we are always looking around and scanning our environments for cues. And some of those cues come from like our managers and our leaders, and some of it comes from us and our peers. And so imagine you're a junior engineer and you've joined this team, and you're ramping into the code base and you're really fired up and excited to like document what you've been doing, and you're taking notes on it, and you go into a code review, and it's with someone maybe that you don't know very well, and they're very tactical and they're kind of short with you, and um you start to feel a little defensive because you're wondering, hey, have I spent too much time, trying to learn, and I didn't ramp up quickly enough? And so maybe you mention something like, hey, I also spent all this time documenting my learning journey, or whatever, all these things that were out of date, and I'm going to for the next person. And then the engineer just says something like, okay, great, like that doesn't really matter, right? That's a really key moment, right? There's some really interesting research in social science saying those threshold moments, those moments like, the syllabus on the first day of class, right? The time that the senior engineer makes an offhand comment, after your first code review, people remember that stuff. And then what they do is they think, I have to look like a senior engineer here. I can't act like one of these people who really invests in, documentation. So it's not like every moment, every conversation has to be like a warm, affirming, like we have to be tactical, we have to get stuff done. But I do think that the messages that we're giving have to be very intentional. And so sometimes we're accidentally flooding people with a lot of messages that say, don't do this. and the stuff is going to catch us up in the future. It already is. We're already struggling with it, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it makes me reflect on, my own behaviors because it's so interesting like you say. I think all engineering teams have documentation as a cultural ideal, right? If
Hmm.
explicitly or implicitly. And ask any senior engineer or lead engineer, and they would say, having good code and a code
Hmm.
base that engineers can work effectively in is definitely a P0 pillar.
Hmm.
Yet, how many of those engineers have probably brushed off an opportunity in their own work to clarify some work they've done or create some documentation? Or how many times has a lead engineer, has someone else suggested, hey, I found this thing confusing, and brush that off as an opportunity to improve? So we don't we don't always live our ideals, I suppose, and
Hmm.
especially in environments where there's so much pressure to just get the next task done, right?
Yeah, and I want to be really clear about something too, which is, sometimes I talk about this work, and you kind of have the like reaction from people that is, well, this is like an eat your vegetables problem. Like, okay, great, we should do it, fine, but like it's another thing to worry about, and I can't be perfect all the time. And the answer that I have to that, like my perspective as a learning scientist, is actually very different. So if I'm going to give you just for a second, like the tools of, how someone like me thinks about this, right? To give your listeners that, um, when I look at this, I think about this is not about adding something. It's actually about making what people are already doing right now, making that better and easier for them. And I think that that's really, really key is that, you can hear this stuff and you can think, okay, we need to have a learning culture. I buy into it. I believe it. I believe, of course, collaboration matters for like this highly complex code work. We all know it. But culture is really hard. It's just really hard. And the answer that I always tell people is culture is really easy. We are all creating culture all the time. It is so a basic part of how we live and work and operate and problem solve. But we have created some of the wrong cultures, for engineering teams. And the good part of that is we really have the power to change it, to say, have we accidentally created a really performance oriented culture where people are not able to be real about the work that's happened? And I think some of that gets perpetuated by people thinking all of that stuff will take care of itself, you know. And it does take care of itself, but in the wrong direction sometimes.
One of the things we asked interview subjects in our paper around developer experience, we would ask them, why, like, what's stopping you from,
Mhm.
like, what's getting in your way of actually improving the developer experience and things like documentation. I'm curious, did you ask people what's in the way? Like, why isn't this happening? And what were some
Yeah.
stories you gained from that?
Yeah. All the time. I mean, I didn't really tell people, hey, we're talking about learning and do you think that you learn? And, because I actually think that people bring so many preconceptions about what that means, and it would have steered the conversation into. So I asked much more about when you get stuck, who do you go to? And tell me about a time you felt frustrated, right? And tell me about if you were going to ramp somebody else into code, how would you do it? What would be the ideal version of doing it? So we got to have these great conversations about, oh my gosh, I would sit next to somebody, we would graph things, the theme of like mental models, we would share our mental models, right? I'm sure, you can think about this in engineering. And then the barriers to that, I mean, there were huge barriers in time. um, I think I noted a lot of these that would sound very familiar to any engineering team, but I was really curious about why they came up. Like code reviews came up a lot, and it came up as a point of social fear, right, for people. And I think in part the problem is the code review, but in part the problem is that you don't have a lot of these people had no other chance to talk to someone outside of a code review. So suddenly code reviews are carrying like the burden of having every possible conversation, and these developers were bringing in like many needs to this one conversation, and it was like I need to feel like I understand what's happening. I need to feel like I'm a good engineer. I need to feel like I get the context on the team. And actually, like the code review is set up for the code. It's not set up for the engineer, right? And I think that that makes sense. But maybe this is a little too meta, right? But I'm a very meta person. So something that I thought about in this project was we have designed so many processes for the production of our code. Why have we not designed processes for the well-being of our people who are creating the code, right? So in a this brings me back to the title of the paper, the coding in the dark paper. These were engineers on highly resourced teams for the most part, like teams with no budget issues. This was not teams who were struggling, in a lot of ways that engineering teams actually do have to struggle. They were quite well resourced, good tools, great education, lots of peers for support. And if these teams were still facing this challenge, right, then there's something a lot deeper culturally going on. Yeah, did that get to some of the barriers for you?
Yeah, no, that was really powerful, and I love that line you shared around we care so much about like the well-being of the code, but not the well-being of the people who are going to have to work with that code in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me, I don't know where I kind of came across this idea. Perhaps when I used to actually teach software development, I remember we would tell students, like remember that your code needs to be understood and run by computers, but it also needs to be understood and run by humans too.
Yeah.
And I think that is often not the point of focus for
Yeah.
developers, even in code review, as you're kind of alluding to, which is really interesting.
I'll tell you something really interesting too. I heard a lot of people say, I would do this and I'm really good at it and there's no room for it here. And I just thought that was sort of interesting and sort of heartbreaking. Like I heard people say, I'm a really good at pair programming. I really like to tell other people how these things work. I remember one story from one of our people in particular who said, I it just he just lit up, right? Like face lit up, said, "Oh, I'm the only person who can holds all of it in my head for this company right now." For like this particular part of the code was the expert, right? And there was nowhere for that to go. There was just this feeling of like, it's good that I'm the expert. They're counting on me, they're relying on me. But the feeling of like, I am a piece of this machine instead of like, I am a piece of a team, right? And and he even said things to me like, I tried to, I came in and I was really excited and I was like, oh, I'm going to hold these little sessions, right? These documentation sessions but it was he had so many creative ideas about how we were going to do this, like sit down with people who were new to the team, do diagramming, and this initiative was just kind of killed, right? Because it was the value of it wasn't seen quickly enough or it wasn't tactically enough, tied to that. And I think we're in this really interesting moment where we're starting to ask ourselves, um, have we really invested in the right things for developer teams? And have we looked at it on the right time cadence? Because I'll just be frank about this. I think it's extraordinary that we're asking people to do this really difficult work in an industry with incredibly high attrition and turnover. So think about like trying to like solve a problem in code, like sometimes over months and years, right? Which is kind of what a code base is. It's like a long-term problem solving, but you have to pass it off all the time, right? So another point I try to tell people when I talk about learning, is learning looks worse before it looks better. Like that's a real paradox. You need to allow people to make mistakes and to experiment and to spend that time where you don't see them writing lines of code yet because they're doing something really critical and important, which is like ensuring that they're going to write the correct lines of code, right?
Yeah. Well, I share your passion for this. And I think you actually raised the point about attrition and the longevity, like how often developers do switch teams or switch into a new area of code or leave the company and go work on an entirely new code base. That there's an enormous cost to that. And I know companies are very concerned with like how quickly they can ramp up developers. Yet there's something still not connecting back to the type of work we're
Yeah.
talking about here, which is
I think
interesting.
we've barely scratched the surface of this problem, honestly. To me it's almost this problem that the industry is just like in denial about. I mean, we know it's happening, of course, from a business perspective, and I think you hear the conversation that is like, look at the estimates, look at the Obama administration like saying high schools probably need to teach more code, right? When you start to, if you just sit down and you write down the numbers, and I do this sometimes, this is my background in education work and things like that. I try to remind myself about base rates. So I'll sit down and because you just get caught up in assumptions like everybody has the chance to major in computer science or something, and then you're like, how many people in higher education go to a 4-year college with a computer science class that will admit people that who didn't take it in high school? Like, there's all these gating mechanisms that end up giving us this incredibly, small pool. And it can feel like everything is tech, everything's engineers, everything, they're everywhere, something like that. I actually see this huge pressure that developers are facing as part of the way that the world around us doesn't have enough people working on these problems right now.
That's really interesting. Well, I want to, we've kind of talked about some of the constraints or wait, I guess dynamics in which developers are inhibited from maybe working on these types of activities and problems on their own.
Mm.
I think part of the problem is more on the organizational side with leadership, right? And you kind of
Hmm.
mentioned like not understanding, not really being aware right now of the impact this has on the bottom line or on outcomes and productivity. And so in the paper, you suggest or recommend this the importance of making the cost of learning debt visible. And you
Hmm.
mentioned that learning debt's cost can be invisible in the short term, sort of conventional productivity metrics, things like lines of code and other output measures. So I'm curious, and I guess this is, I'm looking for free advice from a scientist here, I suppose, because this is something I know so many organizations are struggling with. In fact, I had a conversation just this morning with an organization that was struggling because they know documentation is a big pain point from developers. They ran a survey and learned this, but I think among their many challenges, one of them was actually kind of getting buy-in from their product management
Yeah.
organization that like this will actually help the organization if they improve documentation. So what are the indicators or what can organizations look at today to make the case
Mm.
that investments here might be worthwhile? And maybe this is just a brainstorming session, but
Yeah. Yeah. So there's many parts to this question because there's like, how do we accurately diagnose which thing we need to fix first? How do we measure if it did fix things when we did it, when we made a change? But I'll give you like a few high level things I think about as a scientist here, which is we are not taking advantage of what we already know. We already know developer teams need to collaborate. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And this is where, I mean, I'm here on this podcast because I love that you're doing this, right? Like, organizations can listen to research, like exactly the research you're sharing, and say, okay, we probably don't need to run our own study from the ground up to say collaboration will really matter, right? Where we do maybe need to get specific about our organization is saying, is there something that we're missing about why no one's doing this, right? So when I think about my background in implementation science, right, like we always say, one of my friends just said this to me the other day, like, if you've ever heard this, that experienced professionals worry about logistics, right? And that's a very, I think, engineering mindset too, is like, okay, when we say we're going to make this change, and when we really do it, how are we going to do it? And I think that some big ways leaders can do it is the simple stuff, like say, this is really valuable and we found a way to make sure it is, whether it's like protected time at scale. This may be like the cleanest, lever, even though that's really frightening for people because they don't like to, time will be taken away from other things. But I think it almost always pays off. I mean, if you, I'm rambling a little bit, but if you look at the history of human civilization, investing in learning is maybe the best natural experiment we've ever done. It's besides maybe investing in health.
That's really funny. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
I also think, there's a lot of opportunity to celebrate when this stuff actually is done. So, approach I try to take in my research is say, somewhere in this huge group of people, someone has figured it out. Like that person I was talking to whose face lit up and said, "Oh, I know how to do the hard part. I know how to get someone ramped up into my mental model, but no one's letting me do it." Can we give those people a platform? Can we celebrate it? I think sometimes we think so much about adding things, new initiatives, doing more, saying this is an extra step you have to do. But actually, let's find the places that's already happening and validate and amplify it. And that's where, you know, maybe what did you say? The project manager, the program
Yeah,
manager,
the product
the
managers.
product managers need to see those celebrations. So they actually, that alone will maybe convince them, right? Um, Another thing I recommend often is to take a notice in your organization if you're a leader. Ask yourself whether every conversation that people have is a performance related conversation. And if there's ever a time when they just get to talk about the work and their own development separate from like giving a status update, proving the performance of it. And that's where you actually see like these incredible creative problem solving, people that we've all hired. They will figure out how to do it. They'll figure out how to do good documentation, right? So I ask myself all the time, what is competing with this? Like, does someone feel like this isn't really a documentation conversation? This is actually a like defend the fact that my team has the right budget kind of conversation or something else? If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, so many ideas there. My head's drifting a little bit just thinking about that last piece
I
you
spent
brought
a
up.
lot of time with this topic. Yeah.
Yeah. No, no, I love it. Um, well, we're actually at time, so I want to wrap this up. But where can people follow more of the work you're doing now? Other research you've done? What?
Yeah, absolutely. So very exciting. I have a lab, the Developer Insights Lab at Flow, at Pluralsight Flow. And so we're hoping to put out external research. Like, please, keep it on your radar. And I'll send that to you for sure when we do. I'm also on Twitter, at Grimalkina is a good place for me, which you can probably link in this. Um, that's just where I share a lot of thoughts about stats and science and whatever else. Yeah, but the Developer Insights Lab, like, we're very excited to, you should hopefully see more papers kind of like this from us.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your research and for your continued work in this area. And I really enjoyed this chat. Thanks for coming on the show.